Can we practice Buddhism while working? Have you ever wondered if it's possible to practice spirituality while buried under mountains of emails, meetings, and endless deadlines? It might surprise you to know that most people, even the busiest executives, are finding ways to weave mindfulness into their daily grind. And it's not just for monks in the mountains, it's for everyone, everywhere. In fact, studies show that integrating spiritual practices into your workday doesn't just boost well-being, it enhances productivity and focus, creating a deeper connection to both your career and your true self. In today's video, we're diving deep into the art of practicing Buddhism while working full-time, uncovering how your office space can become a dojo for mindfulness, compassion, and personal growth. Stick around until the end to discover powerful practices that can transform your workday and your life, starting today. For centuries, there has been a prevailing notion that spiritual progress can only be attained by renunciation, that to walk the true path of Buddhism, one must separate themselves from the world and retreat into solitude. This idea has deep roots in the stories of monks and ascetics who, throughout history, abandoned their homes, their families, and their careers in pursuit of enlightenment. We often hear tales of the Buddha's own renunciation. He left behind a life of luxury, wealth, and comfort in the royal palace, choosing instead to live as an ascetic, seeking answers to life's deepest questions. It was a dramatic departure from the material world, a symbolic act of rejecting attachment and worldly distractions. In this light, it is easy to assume that to be a serious practitioner of Buddhism, one must also detach themselves from the hustle of daily life. To progress spiritually, the thinking goes, I must leave my job behind, forsake all material possessions, and embark on a solitary journey of self-discovery. Perhaps, like the Buddha, I too must head for the mountains. But this perception, while deeply ingrained, forms an illusion, a false dichotomy between the sacred and the mundane. The Buddha's life was not a rejection of the world but an invitation to transform how one engages with it. The true path of Buddhism does not require isolation but an awakening to the sacredness of every moment, regardless of the setting. The marketplace, once considered the epitome of worldly distractions, can be a monastery in disguise. The bustling office, the crowded streets, the noise and rush of daily tasks, all of these are not barriers to spiritual growth but opportunities to practice mindfulness, awareness, and compassion. Consider the ancient wisdom of the Zen masters, who recognized that spiritual practice was not confined to the meditation hall. They understood that one could experience enlightenment not only in stillness but in action. The daily chores of sweeping the floor, preparing food, or tending to the garden were seen as sacred rituals in themselves. Every task, no matter how simple or mundane, could be an expression of deep awareness. These masters taught that the sacred is not a place to escape to, but a state of being to embody in the midst of ordinary life. Throughout history, there have been many who embodied this principle. One such example is the 13th century Zen monk and poet, Ikkyu Sojin. Known for his rebellious spirit and unconventional approach, Ikkyu lived a life that defied typical monastic traditions. Rather than retreating from society, he embraced it fully, using his poetry and teachings to awaken people in their everyday lives. He believed that true enlightenment could be found in the here and now, not in some distant, imagined place. His life was a testament to the fact that one could be fully engaged in the world and still live a deeply spiritual life. The same principle applies today. You don't have to leave your job, your family, or your community to practice Buddhism. In fact, these very aspects of life can become the very grounds for your spiritual growth. The challenge is not to escape the world, but to live in it with full awareness. To bring the same mindfulness and presence to your work as you would to your meditation cushion. It's not about where you are, but how you are. True practice is not about seeking a sacred environment, but about cultivating a sacred attitude in every environment. When you approach life with mindfulness, even the most ordinary tasks become opportunities for profound spiritual practice. Take the example of Thich Nhat Hanh, the beloved Vietnamese Buddhist monk and peace activist. Despite living in the modern world, Thich Nhat Hanh brought Buddhism into every aspect of his daily life. He taught that even the act of washing the dishes could be a profound act of mindfulness. By being fully present in every moment, regardless of how small or seemingly insignificant, one can experience the true essence of Buddhist practice. In his words, when you wash the dishes with mindfulness. You are not washing the dishes in order to finish washing the dishes, but you are washing the dishes to wash the dishes. This is the essence of the Buddha's teaching. It is not about where you are or what you do, but how you engage with it. The path to enlightenment does not lie in abandoning the world but in transforming how we relate to it. The true practice is in recognizing that every moment, whether at work, at home, or in solitude, is an opportunity to awaken. The sacred is not something external, but something that arises from within us, as we learn to live fully in the present moment, with awareness, compassion, and wisdom. The Buddha's life, often reduced to the dramatic moment of his renunciation, is a testament to a much deeper and more profound principle: engagement with life, not escape from it. Yes, the Buddha left his palace, but it was not to retreat into a quiet cave or to shut himself off from the world. His renunciation was not about rejecting life, it was about engaging with it in a way that transcended the ordinary. After he achieved enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, he didn't retreat into isolation. He didn't hide away in monasteries or withdraw into a secluded ashram. Instead, he walked from village to village, meeting people where they were. He entered bustling marketplaces, sat in the homes of kings, and broke bread with beggars. His presence in these spaces was no coincidence, it was a deliberate act of engagement with the very world he sought to help liberate. The Buddhist teachings were deeply practical. He didn't promise that enlightenment was found in withdrawing from society. Instead, he taught that wisdom, compassion, and mindfulness could, and should, be applied to whatever you were already doing. His audience was not just monks and ascetics, it was farmers, merchants, soldiers, prostitutes, and even parents. He understood that these people were not separate from the spiritual path, they were the very fabric of the world that needed awakening. In his teachings, the Buddha didn't call for people to abandon their responsibilities or cast aside their worldly possessions. Rather, he urged them to bring awareness and compassion into every aspect of their lives. Whether you were working in the fields, selling goods in the marketplace, or sitting at the king's court, the message was clear: every moment, every task, and every relationship is an opportunity to practice mindfulness. A key aspect of this practical engagement with life is found in the concept of right livelihood, one of the crucial elements of the Eightfold Path. Right livelihood doesn't mean abandoning your job or rejecting material success. Instead, it means earning a living in a way that causes no harm to others, that aligns with ethical values, and that contributes to the well-being of society. The Buddha was clear: your livelihood, your work, your career, is not an obstacle to your spiritual growth. It can be a vehicle for awakening, if you choose to engage with it mindfully. Consider the example of the great Indian king Ashoka, whose life is a shining beacon of the Buddha's teachings in action. Ashoka initially ruled with brutality, his empire built on conquest and violence. But after a series of wars and the horrors they brought, he turned to Buddhism and adopted the path of non-violence, compassion, and right livelihood. His transformation was not one of withdrawal but of radical engagement. He didn't leave his throne, he used his power to serve others, implementing policies of peace, welfare, and tolerance. His reign is a living proof that one can practice the Buddha's teachings even from the highest echelons of power. Even in modern times, we see this principle in action. Take someone like Aung San Suu Kyi, the Burmese leader and Nobel Peace Prize laureate. While she was not a monk or a traditional ascetic, her life and leadership have been shaped by deeply Buddhist principles: compassion, non-violence, and mindful engagement with the challenges of her country. She did not abandon her country or retreat into a life of isolation. Instead, she engaged fully with the political, social, and cultural realities of her people, all the while maintaining her commitment to Buddhist ethics. The key lesson from the Buddha's life is this: spirituality is not about fleeing the world, but about transforming your relationship with it. The path to enlightenment isn't found by avoiding the marketplace or rejecting family responsibilities. It is found by engaging with life fully, with awareness, compassion, and a commitment to right action. Your career, your family life, your social engagements, none of these are distractions from the spiritual path. They are the very arena in which the practice unfolds. Every interaction, every challenge, every success, and every failure can be an opportunity to cultivate wisdom and compassion. The workplace, the home, and even the marketplace are not barriers to your spiritual journey. They are the very places where you can apply the Buddha's teachings and experience awakening. Thus, your work is not an obstacle to your practice. It is a powerful tool that can help you develop the qualities of mindfulness, right intention, and compassion. Whether you are a teacher, a doctor, a parent, or a leader, the principles of Buddhism are there to guide you. The true path of Buddhism is not one of escape, but one of engagement, engaging with the world with a heart full of awareness, compassion, and wisdom. In the Zen tradition, there is an old saying that encapsulates the profound relationship between work and mindfulness: a day without work is a day without food. This saying goes far beyond a mere reflection on the necessity of physical labor. It speaks to the very core of Zen practice, the idea that work itself can be a path to enlightenment. The Zen monks of ancient times did not retreat to quiet monasteries and spend all their days in meditation. Instead, they embraced the fullness of life, engaging in every task with the same mindfulness and awareness that they would bring to their formal sitting practice. They farmed the land, prepared meals, swept the temple floors, and even repaired the roofs. All of these tasks were not seen as distractions or mundane chores. They were seen as the very medium in which the practitioner could cultivate mindfulness and awareness. This is not some far-off ideal of distant, ancient times. It is the essence of Zen, the integration of spiritual practice into everyday life. It is in the daily acts of living that one finds the true opportunity for awakening. One of the most influential Zen masters, Dogen, taught what he called practice realization. He emphasized that enlightenment was not something to be attained in some distant future, nor was it confined to the confines of a meditation hall. Enlightenment was something that had to be cultivated in each moment, in the most ordinary of tasks. Dogen believed that each action, whether it was peeling vegetables, chopping wood, or folding robes, was a direct manifestation of one's spiritual practice. There was no separation between the sacred and the ordinary. Every moment, every movement, was an opportunity to express one's true nature. Consider the way Dogen approached his own life. His Zen temple in Japan was not an isolated retreat removed from the world, it was a place of dynamic activity. Dogen's monks did not simply practice sitting meditation for hours on end. They worked in the fields, cared for the animals, and maintained the temple grounds. The act of working itself became an extension of their meditation. Each task was performed with deep focus, attention, and reverence. There was no separation between spiritual time and ordinary time. There is a story in the Zen tradition that further illuminates this connection between work and mindfulness. A young monk approached his master and asked, "How can I practice mindfulness throughout the day?" The master replied, "When you are hungry, eat. When you are tired, sleep." The student, eager for a more profound answer, protested, "But everyone does that. What's special about that?" The master smiled and gently replied, "No, most people eat with 1,000 thoughts. They sleep with 1,000 dreams. A true practitioner eats when eating, sleeps when sleeping." This profound simplicity contains the key to Zen practice. It's not about what you are doing, but how you are doing it. The practice is in the doing, not in the outcome. The mind often wanders to 1,000 distractions, making it difficult to truly engage with the present moment. Yet the Zen practitioner knows that the true art of living is in the act of being fully present in each moment. Whether it's eating, sleeping, or working in the rice fields, each action becomes an expression of mindfulness and awakening. This principle is not limited to ancient monks or far-off monasteries. It is deeply relevant to modern life. In a world where distractions are abundant and the pace of life is relentless, it is easy to fall into the trap of mindlessly going through the motions. How many times have we eaten our meals without truly tasting the food, or slept without fully resting? How often do we work without being truly present, our minds scattered across 1,000 other concerns? The Zen teaching invites us to reclaim the simplicity and power of working when working. It invites us to engage with each task fully, to bring the same awareness to the simplest of activities as we would to sitting in meditation. When we sweep the floor, we sweep the floor. When we drive the car, we drive the car. When we respond to emails, we respond to emails. In Zen, the key is not in seeking special moments of awakening but in realizing that every moment is an opportunity to awaken. Every task, no matter how mundane it may seem, can be an act of mindfulness. The Zen masters understood this deeply, and it is why their teachings are so profound and timeless. They did not seek to escape from the world. They sought to engage with it more fully, to live with a presence and awareness that transforms even the most ordinary activities into profound expressions of spiritual practice. This truth is perhaps best illustrated in the story of the great Zen master Linji. Known for his fiery temper and radical teachings, Linji would often remind his students that true practice was not found in tranquil meditation, but in how one engaged with the world. He famously said, "If you meet the Buddha, kill the Buddha." What he meant by this was that true practice is not about clinging to external forms of spirituality but about living fully and authentically in the world as it is. It is not about the outward appearance of being spiritual, but about embodying the teachings in the way you live your life. The Zen path is not about retreating from life, but about engaging with it fully. With presence and mindfulness. Whether you are in the rice fields, the office, or at home with your family, every moment is an opportunity to practice. It is in the simple, everyday acts of living that we cultivate our true nature and come to understand the profound wisdom of the Buddhist teachings. Work, when done with mindfulness, becomes a direct path to awakening. Consider the story of Amanda, a senior executive at a global marketing firm, whose life was a perpetual cycle of high-stakes meetings, international flights, and ceaseless demands. Her schedule was a constant whirlwind, early mornings, late nights, and a cacophony of emails, deadlines, and conference calls. Her body was often fatigued, her mind always racing, and for years, she had justified to herself that spirituality simply had no place in her demanding life. Meditation, she reasoned, was something to be done in the tranquility of the morning, and work was something to be compartmentalized, a task of its own, separate from any deeper, spiritual practice. But as with many stories of awakening, it was a moment of overwhelming stress that prompted a profound shift. During a particularly intense quarter end, Amanda found herself in a crucial meeting, struggling to keep pace with the demands swirling around her. Her thoughts were fragmented, her body tight with tension, and she suddenly realized that she hadn't taken a single breath of awareness all day, not even a moment to center herself amid the storm of activity. It was then that something inside her snapped. She had been running on autopilot, trapped in the relentless cycle of work, yet spiritually starved. The realization hit her like a wave, and in that moment, she knew she needed to change. That night, Amanda made a commitment to herself. Instead of resigning to the chaos that was her daily existence, she decided to transform how she interacted with it. She began weaving mindfulness into her daily routine, recognizing that spiritual practice doesn't require an escape from the world, but rather a deeper engagement with it. She didn't need to carve out hours of meditation in a secluded space. She began to find her Zen in the spaces between meetings, during her lunch breaks, and even while responding to emails. At first, it wasn't easy. Her workdays were still hectic, the pressure still intense. But slowly, Amanda discovered that it wasn't about making life less busy. It was about changing her relationship to it. As she focused on being present, she started to notice the beauty in the simplest of tasks, answering a phone call with full attention, carefully reviewing reports as if each line mattered, meeting with her team with genuine presence and care. She found herself becoming fully immersed in whatever she was doing, without the mental noise that had once accompanied her every action. The real magic didn't happen when Amanda tried to escape the whirlwind of her corporate life. It occurred when she stopped trying to change the external world and instead focused on transforming her inner state. The frantic pace of her work didn't slow down, but her awareness deepened. The overwhelming pressures remained, but she no longer identified with them. The chaos of her environment ceased to dominate her mind. This story mirrors a fundamental truth in Buddhist practice: awakening doesn't happen when you leave your environment behind. It happens when you learn to live fully in the present moment, regardless of external circumstances. Amanda's story is a modern-day example of Zen in the workplace. She didn't have to retreat to a monastery to find peace. She found it within the very place that once felt like a source of endless stress and distraction. This is the essence of Buddhist teachings in the modern world, the realization that every aspect of life, no matter how fast-paced or overwhelming, can be an opportunity for mindfulness and awakening. In the rush of the corporate world, there is still space for stillness. In the flurry of tasks, there is room for presence. The key is not to escape the world, but to engage with it deeply and mindfully. Amanda's transformation wasn't about making her work easier, it was about seeing her work through the lens of mindfulness. In the same way that Zen monks practice with a broom in hand or a garden to tend, Amanda discovered that the art of mindfulness could be practiced in the act of answering an email or reviewing a report. It's a reminder that spirituality doesn't belong to a distant, secluded space. It can, and should, be fully integrated into everyday life. In fact, some of the most profound spiritual practices happen not in silence, but in the cacophony of the modern world. The art of mindfulness lies in the ability to find peace in the midst of chaos, to remain centered in the whirlwind of life. The beauty of Amanda's transformation is that she became a living example of what it means to truly embody the teachings of Buddhism in the corporate world, not by abandoning her work, but by bringing a deep sense of awareness to it. Amanda's story is a powerful illustration of how Buddhist principles can be applied to even the most hectic, demanding careers. She discovered that true peace doesn't require the absence of noise or pressure, but the presence of mindfulness in every moment. It is a reminder to us all that, no matter how intense our lives may become, there is always the possibility to awaken, not by stepping away from life, but by fully stepping into it, with clear eyes and an open heart. There is a pervasive myth that runs through the spiritual world, the idea that in order to find peace or true spiritual awakening, one must retreat from the world, abandon their job, or leave behind their responsibilities. The assumption is that the real world is inherently distracting, chaotic, or corrupting, and therefore, to connect with something deeper, one must escape it entirely, but this is a misconception that runs contrary to the core teachings of the Buddha. The Buddha never told his followers to abandon their professions, their families, or their lives as they knew them. He didn't advocate for a life of seclusion or renunciation of worldly duties. Instead, he urged his disciples to engage with the world, but with mindfulness. The Buddha's teachings weren't about escaping life but transforming how we interact with it. His message wasn't that we must abandon our roles in society but that we must awaken to the deeper potential of those very roles. Think about the Buddha himself. After leaving his royal palace, he didn't retreat to an isolated cave and meditate for the rest of his life. Instead, he engaged with the world, teaching in villages, conversing with kings, and sharing wisdom with ordinary people, farmers, merchants, warriors, and even criminals. The Buddha's life was not one of renunciation in the sense we commonly understand, it was one of deep engagement with life as it was. The key lesson here is that peace and awakening are not about withdrawal. They are about engagement with the world, but with a transformed perspective. One of the most powerful aspects of the Buddha's teachings is how they transcend the duality of spiritual versus mundane. Too often, we think of spirituality as something that happens only in temples, quiet retreats, or in moments of meditation. We see work, stress, and the everyday demands of life as obstacles to spiritual growth. But the Buddha would argue that these very challenges, the noisy meetings, the emails, the mundane tasks, are the places where awakening can occur. The true practice is not in the absence of these things, but in how we approach them. This principle is beautifully reflected in the Zen teachings. Zen is often associated with rigorous meditation, but it is also deeply connected to everyday work and activities. The famous Zen saying, "When you're sweeping, sweep, when you're eating, eat," captures this notion perfectly. It's not about escaping the world to find peace. It's about bringing mindfulness to whatever you're doing, no matter how mundane it may seem. The simplicity of washing dishes or sweeping the floor becomes, in the Zen practice, an opportunity to cultivate awareness and presence. To truly understand this is to break free from the myth that peace is found outside the world. The Zen master, Thich Nhat Hanh, once said, "When you are aware of what is happening, the world itself is your meditation." It's not about retreating into silence to find peace, but about bringing mindfulness to the noise. It's about allowing every moment, no matter how chaotic, to become an opportunity for deep awareness and transformation. This perspective can be a game changer. Instead of seeing your job as an obstacle to your spiritual growth, you can start to see it as the very arena in which you can practice. Imagine the transformative power of bringing your full attention to each task, not just the big, important tasks but even the smallest, seemingly insignificant ones. Each email, each phone call, each meeting can be a moment for you to practice presence, for you to embody the teachings of mindfulness, compassion, and awareness. In fact, the great Tibetan Lama, Chogyam Trungpa, often spoke about how we must meet the world exactly as it is, not as we wish it to be. Spirituality does not happen in a vacuum. He would say, it happens in the midst of confusion and chaos, where we are truly tested. This is the wisdom that transcends the common idea of renunciation. It's not that we have to escape the world to find peace, it's that we must be willing to engage with the world as it is, with full awareness, without fear, without avoidance. By embracing this concept, we break down the idea that to be spiritual, we must quit our jobs, abandon our responsibilities, or live as hermits. The true practice, according to Buddhist philosophy, is about transformation, transforming how we engage with life, transforming how we interact with our work, and transforming the way we respond to the challenges that arise. Peace does not require retreat, it requires a deeper engagement with the present moment, with mindfulness, and with an open heart. Work, in this light, becomes a sacred space. It is not an obstacle, it is an opportunity. An opportunity to practice patience, to cultivate mindfulness, to grow in compassion and understanding. And through this practice, we discover something profound, the realization that peace is not something that comes after work or in the absence of it. Peace is something that we can experience in the midst of it. The Buddha never told us to quit our jobs to find peace. He taught us to find peace in the work we already do. When we embrace our daily tasks with mindfulness, when we transform our approach to work, we open the door to a deeper experience of life. The key is not in escaping the world, but in awakening to it, fully, completely, and without reservation. Mindfulness is far more than a fleeting moment of quiet, it is the art of bringing full presence to every action. In the rush of modern life, it's easy to forget that the present moment is the only true reality we possess. The Buddha's teachings on mindfulness extend far beyond the meditation cushion, they permeate every part of life, every minute, every interaction. Whether you're drafting an email, attending a meeting, or even sipping your morning coffee, each moment can be a moment of awakening. Imagine being fully engaged in the act of typing a report, not as a task to rush through but as an opportunity to be present. Each keystroke is not just an input to a computer but a mindful action that connects you to the world. This is the deep potential of mindfulness, to fully inhabit every task, to treat every moment with reverence. When you focus your attention completely on what you are doing, you become more efficient, more present, and more connected to the world around you. the Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh beautifully captures this essence, saying, "When you wash the dishes, wash the dishes." This simple yet profound reminder calls us to engage fully with the present task, to wash the dishes with as much care and attention as if it were the most sacred act in the world. And when you bring this level of focus to your work, whether it's a minor task or a major responsibility, you begin to transform the mundane into the extraordinary. Right intention, as a core part of the Noble Eightfold Path, asks us to align our actions with the deeper values of kindness, compassion, and wisdom. It's about ensuring that our daily work, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, is performed with the intention to cause no harm and to benefit others. Every action, every interaction is an opportunity to live according to the principles of Buddhism, and this is where the true power of right intention lies. For instance, when you prepare for a business presentation, you could focus on impressing others or securing your success. But if you infuse that same task with right intention, by prioritizing honesty, transparency, and integrity, you transform the energy you bring to the office. Your actions become aligned with something higher, and the work environment shifts. Instead of using your position for personal gain, you use it as a platform to contribute positively to those around you. This not only brings personal fulfillment but creates a ripple effect of good energy within the organization. In history, figures like Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. exemplified the power of right intention. Acting not from self-interest, but from a place of deep moral clarity and compassion. They understood that their actions have the potential to influence not just their immediate surroundings but entire nations. In the same way, when we act with clear, compassionate intention in our work, we contribute to a greater, collective good, far beyond our own lives. In Buddhism, compassion is not just a passive feeling but an active force. It's about recognizing the suffering of others and choosing to alleviate it. This teaching is especially relevant in our professional lives. Too often, workplaces become environments where competition, pressure, and self-interest cloud our interactions with others. But when we choose compassion in the workplace, we cultivate a more harmonious and supportive environment for everyone. Being compassionate doesn't mean letting others walk over you, but it does mean responding with kindness, understanding, and empathy. In your daily interactions, whether with colleagues, clients, or even superiors, you can bring a sense of mindfulness and compassion to each conversation. Imagine the difference it would make to respond to a tense situation with calm understanding rather than frustration, to listen to a colleague with genuine empathy rather than impatience. Consider the Dalai Lama's words, "Be kind whenever possible." It is always possible. Compassion can be as simple as offering a listening ear, being patient in a stressful situation, or showing appreciation for someone's hard work. These small acts of kindness, repeated day after day, have the potential to transform the culture of an organization and, over time, create a workplace where people feel valued and understood. Historical example can be seen in the life of the Buddhist king, Ashoka the Great. After embracing Buddhism, Ashoka transformed his entire rule, not by focusing solely on territorial expansion, but by implementing policies based on compassion, justice, and the well-being of his people. His legacy is a testament to the power of compassionate leadership and how kindness, when integrated into decision-making, can transform entire nations. In the workplace, compassion can be a transformative force. It allows us to see each person as more than just a cog in the machine, recognizing their humanity and worth. This not only elevates the work environment but also deepens our own spiritual practice. The practice of compassion, when carried into every interaction, fosters growth not only in others but also within ourselves. By embracing these three pillars, mindfulness, right intention, and compassion, we can integrate Buddhism into our professional lives in a way that transforms both our work and our spiritual journey. Each pillar offers a tool for cultivating awareness, clarity, and connection with those around us. And as we align our work with the core teachings of Buddhism, we find that the workplace becomes not a distraction from spiritual growth, but an essential arena for it. Imagine stepping into your office not as a place filled with endless to-do lists and looming deadlines, but as a dojo, a sacred space where practice, discipline, and self-awareness converge. Just like the martial artists who step onto the mat to refine their skills, your office becomes your battleground for spiritual practice. Every email you write, every conversation you have, every meeting you attend becomes an opportunity to cultivate mindfulness, sharpen your focus, and deepen your connection to the present moment. The concept of work as a dojo may seem radical in the context of a modern, fast-paced corporate environment, but it has deep roots in ancient traditions. Think of how Zen monks approach their daily rituals. Whether they are sweeping the temple grounds, preparing tea, or tending to the garden, every action is imbued with mindfulness. Their focus is not on achieving some distant goal, but on perfecting each moment, each movement. The same can be done in your office, where each task becomes a form of practice, a way to bring presence, awareness, and intention into the mundane. Start the day with intention. Before diving into the chaos of your daily tasks, take a moment to set a clear, mindful intention. This is not just a productivity hack, but a spiritual practice. As you sit at your desk, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and ask yourself, how do I want to show up today? What energy do you want to bring into your work? Are you aiming to create harmony? To practice patience, to be of service? By setting an intention, you align your actions with something greater than the mere completion of tasks. This simple act of intention setting can transform your day, guiding you toward mindful productivity rather than reactive busyness. This idea is rooted in the teachings of the Buddha, who emphasized the power of intention as the seed for all actions. He reminded his followers that the mind precedes all actions. Whatever a monk keeps pursuing with his thinking and pondering, that becomes the inclination of his awareness. In the same way, if you begin your day with a clear intention, it directs your awareness toward positive outcomes, no matter how complex or stressful the tasks may be. Focus on one thing at a time. In a world of constant distractions, multitasking has become a badge of honor. But as modern science has shown, multitasking doesn't increase efficiency, it diminishes it. When you split your attention, you dilute your focus and reduce your capacity to be fully present. The Buddha's teachings remind us that the quality of attention matters far more than the quantity of tasks completed. In the Zen tradition, the concept of single tasking is central. Zen monks would not hurry through their duties. They would cut wood with full attention, not thinking about the next task. They would sweep the floor with such precision that it became an act of moving meditation. Similarly, when you focus on one task at a time, you bring all of your energy and attention to it, resulting in higher quality work and a deeper sense of satisfaction. Whether it's responding to an email, writing a report, or making a phone call, do it with complete presence. This not only increases productivity but also transforms your work into an act of mindfulness, turning routine tasks into sacred practices. Take mindful breaks. In the relentless rhythm of office life, breaks often become an afterthought, brief moments of respite squeezed between meetings or tasks. However, mindful breaks are essential for maintaining clarity and focus throughout the day. Rather than checking your phone or mindlessly scrolling through emails during lunch, take a moment to truly step away from your work. Go outside if possible, take a few deep breaths, and reset your mind. This practice is not just about taking a break, it's about reconnecting with your inner stillness and resetting your mental state. In the traditional Zen practice, the concept of taking mindful breaks is emphasized during the workday. Zen monks would often pause between their tasks to simply breathe, listen to the sounds around them, and return to the present moment. By incorporating these mindful pauses into your day, you not only refresh your mind but also allow yourself to approach your work with renewed clarity and energy. These breaks are moments to remember your intention, to let go of stress, and to find peace in the midst of the chaos. The beauty of transforming your office into a dojo is that it's not about escaping the pressures of work, it's about changing how you engage with those pressures. It's about recognizing that the office is not merely a space for transactions but a space for spiritual growth. By implementing these simple, yet profound, practices, you begin to see your work as a reflection of your inner discipline, your mindful presence, and your compassionate intentions. The Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh once said, "The way you do anything is the way you do everything." This encapsulates the philosophy behind turning your work into a dojo. By bringing the same mindfulness, discipline, and awareness to your work as you would to meditation or prayer, you begin to realize that every moment is an opportunity to deepen your practice. Every task, no matter how trivial it may seem, becomes a chance to transform the ordinary into the extraordinary, and the workplace into a sacred space. To help you integrate Buddhism into your workday, here's a practical 7-day challenge. Day 1, start with awareness. The journey begins with the simple yet profound act of awareness. Before you dive into the demands of your workday, take a moment to pause. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and tune into your body and mind. Set an intention for the day, a guiding principle or quality you want to embody throughout your tasks. This might be patience, clarity, or compassion. Just as a Zen master begins each practice with a mindful bow, begin your work with an open heart and mind. This initial moment of awareness acts as an anchor, a reminder that the day is not just a sequence of tasks, but a continuous opportunity for spiritual practice. By setting the tone with intentionality, you lay the foundation for a day rooted in presence, regardless of the whirlwind that may unfold. Day 2, practice mindfulness in one task. Today, immerse yourself fully in one task. It could be something as simple as writing an email, organizing your desk, or reviewing a report. The challenge is to focus all your attention on the task at hand, no multitasking, no distractions. In this single action, there is an invitation to practice mindfulness, the art of being wholly present. Recall the teachings of the Buddha: when walking, walk. When eating, eat. Whether you are sorting through paperwork or responding to a query, approach it with the same attention you would give to a sacred ritual. This practice brings the mind back to the present moment, eradicating the anxiety of a never-ending to-do list. You will be surprised how much more satisfying and fulfilling a task can be when you engage in it fully. Day 3, cultivate compassion. On day 3, turn your attention to others. The true measure of compassion lies in our ability to extend kindness to those we encounter. Today, make a conscious effort to be kind in every interaction, whether with a colleague, a client, or even yourself. In the spirit of the Bodhisattvas, who vow to aid others in their path to enlightenment, practice a selfless type of kindness. Hold space for the frustrations of others, listen deeply without judgment, and offer help where possible. Just as the Buddha taught that all beings are interconnected, your acts of compassion ripple out into the world, transforming the workplace into a more harmonious and supportive environment. The historian and civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "Life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others?" Today, let your answer be reflected in the kindness you offer. Day 4, apply right livelihood. Right livelihood, a key component of the Noble Eightfold Path, challenges us to earn a living without causing harm. Today, take a deep dive into the ethical aspects of your work. Reflect on the impact your profession has on the world around you. Are there ways to align your actions more closely with your values? Perhaps you can take steps to minimize harm, promote sustainability, or advocate for fairness. In the tradition of Buddhist teachings, right livelihood isn't just about financial gain, it's about the ethical dimension of your work. Think of the historical figures like the pioneering social entrepreneurs who have used their businesses as vehicles for social change. This day is an invitation to assess how your work can contribute to a greater good, creating not just personal wealth but also wealth for the well-being of others. Day 5, practice gratitude. Gratitude is a transformative force. It shifts our perspective from what is lacking to what is abundant. At the end of today, reflect on the gifts that your work brings, even in the most challenging moments. Whether it's the opportunity to learn, the relationships you've formed, or the financial stability it provides, there is always something to be grateful for. Consider the words of the Zen monk, Thich Nhat Hanh: if you are not able to be happy with what you have, how can you be happy with what you do not have? Gratitude in the workplace doesn't just make us feel good. It grounds us in the recognition that every moment, even in the midst of difficulty, contains a lesson and a blessing. As you go through your day, take time to acknowledge those moments of grace and give thanks for them, no matter how small. Day 6. Let go of attachments. On the 6th day, turn inward. Today's practice is about letting go of attachments, to perfection, to results, to recognition. In the Buddhist tradition, attachment is considered one of the primary sources of suffering. When we attach ourselves to an outcome, we create unnecessary stress and frustration. Release the need for everything to be perfect. Allow yourself to make mistakes and learn from them. As you step into this day, remember that the journey itself is as important as the destination. Whether it's a missed deadline or an imperfect presentation, let go of the judgment and embrace the flow of life as it unfolds. The legendary Zen master, Dogen, taught that enlightenment is found in the present moment, not in some distant future where everything is flawless, but right here, right now, with all its imperfections. Day 7. Reflect and share. The final day of your challenge is one of reflection. Take time to contemplate how your week has unfolded. What has shifted in your approach to work? How has integrating Buddhist principles transformed your experience? Reflect on the moments when mindfulness, compassion, or gratitude illuminated your path. Then, share your insights with a colleague or a friend. Just as the Buddha traveled to share his teachings, sharing your experiences with others not only deepens your own understanding but also helps to spread the wisdom you've gained. The act of reflection and sharing builds a community of practice, where growth is celebrated and supported. In the words of the Buddha, thousands of candles can be lit from a single candle, and the life of the candle will not be shortened. Today, light the flame of insight and pass it on. Imagine waking up every day with the clarity that each moment, no matter how chaotic, is an opportunity for awakening. No more rushing through life, no more distractions, just a smooth flow of presence and purpose. Buddhism isn't about retreating from the world, it's about fully engaging with it. The way you approach your work, your interactions, and your daily tasks determines the depth of your spiritual practice. Shift your mindset, and your reality will transform. Right where you are, now is the time to take control of your journey. Start by bringing mindfulness into every task. Whether it's sending an email, attending a meeting, or simply breathing in the midst of a busy day, each moment holds the potential for awakening. The choice is yours. We are building a community of mindful practitioners who are integrating Buddhism into everyday life. Join us by subscribing and sharing your experience in the comments below. Let's create a ripple effect of mindful living together, empowering each other to find peace and purpose in the hustle and bustle of the modern world. Remember, your life is your dojo. Make it shine.